Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about the strange moment when you finally stop running, not because you've reached your destination, but because you realize you've been chasing the wrong thing entirely. For me, that moment didn't arrive with fireworks or a grand epiphany. It was quieter than that. Quieter, but heavier. You probably wouldn't survive this, at least not without shedding a version of yourself that you've been carrying for far too long. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the little constellation of moments we're all sharing together. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. I remember the day with an uncomfortable precision. The light outside was that strange in-between color. The sun was gone, but the street lamps hadn't quite taken over yet. It matched my mood perfectly. Not bright enough to be hopeful, not dark enough to be dramatic. I'd just finished sending yet another overly thoughtful message to someone who had been treating me with the kind of casual disregard you reserve for free samples in a supermarket. Nice if you notice them, but you could easily walk past without feeling deprived. And here's the thing, I wasn't even angry. I was just tired. Tired of feeling like I had to hand out tasting portions of my worth, hoping someone would take a bite and decide they wanted the whole meal. There's a certain indignity in constantly trying to be digestible. It's like editing yourself into the highlight reel of your own life, hoping the right audience member is watching. An older friend once told me, when you stop trying to be liked, you find people who actually like you. At the time, I thought it was one of those lofty platitudes people offer instead of actual help. But in that moment, staring at the three dots of someone typing for far too long, I understood. I shut my phone off, not silenced it. Off, and instead of wondering whether they'd reply, I wondered why I cared in the first place. There's a common belief in modern life, unspoken but deeply ingrained, that our worth is measured in how many people choose us. That being wanted is proof of being valuable. The trouble is, wanting can be cheap. People want things all the time they don't truly respect. You want a chocolate bar? You buy it. You eat it. You forget about it. Respect. On the other hand, that stays. I had been living like the chocolate bar. Sweet, available, and forgettable. Somewhere in the back of my mind. I'd convinced myself that if I gave enough, smiled enough, stayed patient enough, I would become irreplaceable. But the truth is, the more I gave without being valued, the easier it was for people to treat me like background noise, a pleasant hum, but hardly missed when switched off. There's a peculiar relief in admitting you've been complicit in your own mistreatment, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start tracing the lines of every compromise, every moment you watered yourself down to fit into someone else's cup, and you realize the cup was probably cracked anyway. Here's a quirky little fact I once read. In Japan, there's an art form called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, making the cracks more beautiful than the original smooth surface. I think self-worth works a bit like that. When you've been through enough fractures, you either keep trying to hide them, or you fill them with something valuable enough that you stop caring if they're visible. My cracks were showing, but I'd been trying to paint over them instead of gilding them. So, that evening, instead of crafting another carefully balanced message, I did something radical. Nothing. I let the conversation die. I let the space open. And in that space, I felt the first real breath I'd taken in months. The academic in me, the one who occasionally reads psychology papers late at night for no reason, would call this a self-actualization trigger. It's the point where your identity stops orbiting around other people's acceptance. But to me, it just felt like sitting down after standing too long. My legs ached, but in a satisfying way. The irony, of course, is that when you stop chasing, people notice, not all at once. Not like a flood of apologies and reconnections, but there's a subtle shift. The same people who treated you like an optional extra suddenly wonder why you're not hovering nearby. Some reach out, some don't. But either way, the silence becomes less suffocating. I'd love to say that was the end of it, that I never once slipped back into old habits. But that would be a lie. There were relapses, moments where the old craving for validation would flare up, and I'd feel the itch to prove myself again. But each time, the recovery was faster. Each time, I remembered the relief of that evening, The way the air felt lighter without the weight of waiting for someone else to crown me. The first lesson I learned, and I'll keep coming back to this, is that you cannot truly stop chasing until you understand what you're running after. It wasn't them. It was the hope that their approval could confirm something I hadn't yet accepted about myself. That's the joke no one tells you. You're never actually chasing them. You're chasing the version of yourself you think they'll make you believe in. And when you see it for what it is, you can finally stop. The first few days after I stopped chasing felt oddly like quitting coffee. I'd been so used to the constant buzz of checking my phone, the little dopamine hits from responses, even the disappointing ones, that without them, I felt both liberated and strangely sluggish. I'd built a habit of being available, of anticipating needs, of molding my schedule around people who barely glanced at their watches for me. Now, I was staring at empty hours that felt like blank pages. It's in those blank spaces that self-worth begins to show itself, or rather, the lack of it. I realized how uncomfortable I was with stillness, because stillness left room for questions I had avoided. Who was I when I wasn't trying to be useful to someone? Who was I when I wasn't performing likability? Old age wisdom has a way of cutting through the noise. And a neighbor once told me over tea, if you don't know your value, you'll always sell at a discount. At the time, I laughed politely, but sitting there with my phone face down, I understood exactly what she meant. I had been on permanent clearance sale, offering my time, my energy, my care at the lowest possible price in the hopes of quick turnover. The trouble with selling yourself cheap is that people don't see a bargain. They see something disposable. And once you start to believe you're disposable, you live accordingly. It's a bit like the Pygmalion effect, a debatable academic concept that says people rise or fall to meet the expectations placed upon them. If others expect little of you, and you accept those low expectations, you often unconsciously meet them. I had been living inside a low expectation box, decorated with polite smiles and eagerness, wondering why I felt so small. So, I started small in changing that. Not with grand affirmations shouted in the mirror, those always felt like bad theater to me, but with the tiniest shifts in behavior. I stopped saying yes automatically. I paused before answering texts, not to play games, but to actually check in with myself. Do I want to engage right now? Or am I doing it out of fear of seeming unavailable? That word, unavailable, had felt poisonous to me before. I equated it with rejection, with being forgotten. But slowly, I began to see it as the soil where self-worth grows. Being unavailable created scarcity, and scarcity makes people pay attention. Here's a quirky fact for you. The rarest stamp in the world is the British Guiana 1C Magenta from 1856. It's been called the Mona Lisa of stamps and is worth millions. Not because it's particularly beautiful, but because there's only one known copy. Its value comes entirely from scarcity. Now, I'm not saying you should live your life as a stamp, but the principle stands. Common things are treated commonly. When I stopped offering myself so freely, the energy shifted. Some people tried harder, suddenly aware of my absence. Others faded away completely, which was its own quiet blessing. It became a natural filter. Those who valued me stayed. Those who didn't slip through the net without me having to tug at it. The truth is, self-worth doesn't scream. It doesn't demand recognition. It's the calm in a crowded room. The person who doesn't need to be noticed to feel real. I wanted that for myself, not as a performance, but as a default state. I remember walking into a cafe one morning, ordering my coffee, and deliberately leaving my phone in my bag. I sat there for nearly an hour, just watching people come and go, the steam curling up from my cup, the clatter of cups against saucers. Nobody needed me. Nobody was waiting on me. And yet, I felt oddly whole. Of course, the transformation wasn't all Zen mornings and poetic cafe moments. There were evenings when the silence roared, when I felt the urge to check whether I'd been remembered, to prod the universe and ask, am I still here? But each time I resisted, I grew a little more comfortable with the idea that my existence didn't need confirmation. The thing about embracing your own value is that it's less about inflating your ego and more about dissolving your dependence. It's standing on the shore and realizing you don't have to swim after every boat that passes. You can let some drift away without boarding them. If I could distill that early stage into one piece of advice, it would be this: don't rush to fill the gaps people leave. Those gaps are where you meet yourself and where you learn that you are not a half, but a whole. And slowly, The world starts to treat you as such. The day I became truly unavailable without apology didn't feel dramatic. There was no triumphant music, no cinematic montage of me slamming doors and deleting contacts. It was quiet, almost suspiciously so. I just didn't respond. Not in anger, not in passive aggression, but because I simply didn't want to. That was it. If you've ever been the yes person in your circle, you'll know how unnatural that feels. It's like suddenly switching from speaking in your native language to trying to order dinner in a dialect you barely know. Awkward, halting, and full of second guessing. But I told myself, no more guilt for not being everywhere all the time. My life isn't a public service announcement. I used to equate unavailability with selfishness. But an elderly uncle once told me, boundaries aren't walls, they're doors with locks. You can still let people in, you just decide who gets a key. And in my case, I had been handing out spare keys like party favors, wondering why my mental living room always looked ransacked. At first, I noticed subtle shifts. Friends would message, "Hey, haven't heard from you? Everything okay?" Not in the usual concerned tone, but in a way that suggested my sudden distance was an event. I'd become a variable they couldn't quite predict. People who were used to me adjusting to them now had to adjust to me. That's when I realized how much I'd been bending without noticing. Academics might call this self-concept clarity, a term that's oddly debated because it sounds deceptively simple. Knowing who you are and acting accordingly. Yet many of us live in blurred outlines, filling in our shape based on other people's needs. I was finally coloring inside my own lines, not someone else's. One particularly revealing moment came at work. A colleague dropped a last-minute task on my desk, clearly expecting my usual "sure, no problem." But instead, I smiled and said, "I can't take this on right now." I didn't over-explain, didn't pile on excuses, just a simple no. The silence that followed was almost comical, like I'd just announced I was quitting civilization to live in a lighthouse. Here's a quirky fact. In Japanese business culture, the word emma refers to the pause or space between things. It's considered essential for balance. In Western culture, we tend to rush to fill pauses, to remove the may with action or words. But the power of becoming unavailable is about creating that space, letting others feel your absence so they understand its value. And value is the key word. When you stop making yourself endlessly accessible, you teach people to respect your time, the way they'd respect a reserved seat at a theater. They might still ask, but they understand it's not guaranteed. Of course, this shift wasn't universally celebrated. Some people reacted like I'd committed a personal betrayal. The truth is, when you've been the free refill in someone's life, they're not going to cheer when you start charging for the cup. But that's their adjustment to make, not yours. There were days I wavered, moments when I thought, maybe I'm being too cold, too distant. But then I'd remember the countless times I'd run myself ragged trying to please, only to be met with indifference. The maths just didn't add up. Why should I bankrupt myself emotionally for people who never even balance the ledger? And here's where the wisdom of age comes in again. My grandmother once told me, people rarely appreciate what's always on tap. They start valuing it when the well runs dry. She was talking about water. But the principle applies to everything. Unavailability isn't cruelty, it's conservation. So I started embracing the lock and key model. Some days I kept the door wide open, but only when I genuinely wanted company. Other days, I turned the key and let the silence in. The surprising part, my relationships didn't collapse. If anything, the ones worth keeping became stronger, more intentional, more respectful. What I learned was this: being unavailable isn't about punishing others. It's about protecting your finite resources, your time, your attention, your peace. And when you stop apologizing for that, you stop negotiating your worth like it's a clearance item. From then on, unavailable became my default setting, and available was the choice I made, not the state I was trapped in. The strange thing about finally respecting your own time is that you start noticing just how much of it you used to waste. Not wasted in the sense of lying on the sofa watching the ceiling fan spin. That kind of waste can be deeply restorative. I mean the energy leak sort of waste, where you keep showing up to conversations, situations, or commitments that leave you drained and quietly resentful. When I was always available, I thought I was being a good friend, colleague, and family member. The reality, I was often just padding other people's schedules at the expense of my own. It was like being the free parking space everyone fought over, except no one ever asked whether I minded being used that way. Once I became unavailable by default, I started to see patterns. There were people who reached out only when they needed something: help with a project, a lift to the airport, emotional reassurance at midnight. But if I flipped the scenario and needed them, they'd vanish quicker than my phone battery when I'm streaming videos on 4G. I once read a line, attributed to some philosopher whose name I've forgotten, that said, "The easiest way to know your standing in someone's life is to remove yourself for a while and see if they notice." It sounds cynical, but it's not. It's clarity disguised as absence. And clarity is what I was starting to live for. It reminds me of something a retired teacher once told me. She said, "If you keep giving extra credit, they'll stop trying for full marks." That applies to relationships just as much as it does to classrooms. If you overextend without boundaries, the baseline expectation becomes your overextension. There's no incentive for reciprocity when one person is doing all the heavy lifting. Here's a quirky fact. In the Victorian era, letter writing was a slow, deliberate art. People would take days, sometimes weeks, to respond, not because they didn't care, but because communication wasn't designed to be instant. You couldn't ping someone at any hour and expect a reply within minutes. That delay gave relationships a kind of breathing space we've completely lost today. By stepping back, I was essentially bringing back my own Victorian delay. But unavailability wasn't just about protecting myself from takers. It also gave me more room to be fully present for the people who genuinely mattered. Instead of being stretched paper thin across dozens of shallow connections, I could go deep with the handful of people I trusted most. Those conversations were richer, the silences more comfortable. Academically speaking, this could be tied to the Dunbar's number theory, the idea that humans can only maintain about 150 meaningful relationships at once, and far fewer at a truly intimate level. It's debated, of course, but whether the magic number is 150 or 15, the point remains. There's a limit to how many people we can give our best to. I'd been pretending my limit didn't exist, and it showed. Pulling back also exposed how much of my so-called busyness had been self-inflicted. There's a weird ego boost in being needed all the time. It makes you feel important, until you realize you're just a permanent backup plan for people who have other priorities. Once I stepped out of that role, I had to confront the fact that I'd been mistaking overcommitment for significance. There was a night when this hit me especially hard. I was sitting alone in my kitchen, half a cup of tea gone cold in front of me, and it struck me. I wasn't lonely, I was unaccustomed to peace. The absence of noise felt foreign because I'd built my identity around being in motion, being available, being on call for everyone else's lives. My grandmother's voice came back to me then. One of her favorite sayings, "Even the sun rests at night." Simple, obvious, but I'd been living as though I could shine indefinitely without burning out. That's the quiet lie of constant availability. It feels generous, but it's unsustainable. So I made a rule. No more saying yes just because I can, if I didn't want to, or if it meant sacrificing my own rest. It was a no, not a maybe later, not a let me think about it, but a clean, clear no. The reactions varied. Some people respected it immediately. Others took it as a personal challenge, testing my boundaries to see if I'd break, and a few drifted away entirely, which, in hindsight, saved me the trouble of making that decision myself. The funny thing, the more I leaned into unavailability, the more I noticed how attractive it made my time. Suddenly, invitations felt more deliberate, conversations more meaningful. People valued me more because they knew my attention wasn't on tap. It had to be earned. And in the spaces between, I began to feel something I hadn't in years. Unhurried. I could breathe, think, and move at my own pace. I'd stopped being a supporting character in other people's schedules. And for the first time in a long time, I was fully present in my own story. There's a subtle, almost sneaky magic in slowing down, when you're no longer tethered to the expectation of answering every ping, call, or knock. Life starts to feel less like a queue you're stuck in and more like a landscape you can actually explore. The first thing I noticed was how much I'd been missing in my own surroundings. The street outside my flat, always just a blur I passed through, suddenly had details. A crooked lamppost leaning like it had secrets to tell. The quiet tap of rain hitting the metal bin lids. A neighbor's cat who sat watching the world as if it were her personal television. These were the sorts of things I'd been too busy to notice, even though they were right under my nose. It's funny, there's this old saying, if you can't find peace where you are, you won't find it anywhere. I used to think it was a platitude, something people said when they'd given up on their dreams. But it's not about giving up. It's about realizing that peace isn't waiting in some far-off location. It's in the moments we're usually too rushed to inhabit. The academic world might frame this as mindfulness in practice, which is hotly debated for being overly commodified in recent years. But when you strip it back from apps and corporate seminars, it's just about paying attention without a stopwatch running in your head. A quirky fact I stumbled across during this period. In the early days of telephones, people thought constant accessibility would cause mental strain and even nervous collapse. There were actual articles warning about the dangers of being reachable at all hours. Fast forward a century, and here we are, voluntarily carrying devices that let anyone on the planet interrupt us at any moment, often for things that could wait, or didn't need to be said at all. Once I started filtering who and what could reach me, I realized something else. Most of what I'd been responding to wasn't urgent. It wasn't even important. It was filler. And filler is what steals the hours you never get back. One afternoon, a friend texted asking if I could just pop over to help her rearrange her living room furniture. The old me would have been there in 20 minutes, moving her sofa while she decided whether the armchair had the right energy in that corner. This time, I politely declined, saying I was in the middle of something. The something was me sitting in my chair, reading a book, and letting the kettle boil slowly. Her response was brief. Okay, no worries. No offense taken. No friendship ended. It hit me then that a lot of the pressure I'd felt to be constantly present had been entirely self-inflicted. People weren't as dependent on me as I thought. They'd just grown accustomed to my easy availability. My grandfather used to say, "You're not a lighthouse for every lost ship." He had a point. If you try to light the way for everyone, you burn out your own bulb and leave yourself in the dark. Still, there were moments when the quiet felt too quiet. And I wondered if I'd tipped the balance too far. Would people eventually stop reaching out altogether? But each time that thought crept in, I reminded myself I wasn't withdrawing from life. I was editing it. It's a bit like curating a gallery. If you fill the walls with every random piece that comes your way, no one, including you, can appreciate the art. But if you select only what matters, you create a space where each piece has presence. And with that space, something unexpected emerged. Creativity with fewer distractions. I began writing again, sketching ideas that had been buried under months of busyness. I baked bread, badly, at first, but with steady improvement. I even started running. Though my pace was so slow, a man walking his dog overtook me and offered a sympathetic nod. The point wasn't speed or perfection. It was that I was living on my terms, in my own tempo. And that tempo was gentler, quieter, but somehow richer. By stepping back, I discovered the luxury of choosing where my energy went. And that choice, more than anything, felt like freedom. One of the more unexpected side effects of becoming less available was how it shifted the way I spoke. My conversations. Once quick-fire exchanges peppered with, "I'll get back to you," or "just give me a sec," slowed down. I noticed I was actually listening, not just waiting for my turn to speak or mentally drafting my to-do list while someone else was talking. It's strange to admit, but I'd been guilty of half listening for years. The performance of listening, yes, but not the real thing. I'd nod, make the right noises, even throw in a well-timed joke, but part of me was always elsewhere. The moment I stopped rushing, I had the mental space to be fully present. I remember one afternoon sitting in a cafe with an old friend. Normally, we'd plow through topics like we were on a news panel, trying to cover everything before the tea went cold. But this time, our pace matched the lazy drift of the steam curling up from our mugs. There were pauses, real, comfortable pauses, where neither of us felt compelled to fill the silence. And in those spaces, her words landed differently. I understood not just what she was saying, but how she was saying it. An old bit of wisdom from my aunt floated into my mind that day. If you're always talking, you're not learning. She'd been right. The quiet between words isn't emptiness. It's where meaning settles. Academically, there's something called conversational turn-taking. Often studied in linguistics and psychology, the idea is that good dialogue is like a dance. Each person has to know when to step forward and when to step back. We think we're naturally good at this. But honestly, Most of us are stomping all over each other's toes without realizing it. Here's a quirky fact. In Japanese culture, silence in conversation isn't awkward, it's respected. Pauses are considered a sign of thoughtfulness, an indication you're giving the other person's words the space they deserve. Compare that to Western small talk, where even a 2-second gap can feel like a void. We must rush to fill with weather updates or complaints about traffic. When I began honoring those silences, my relationship subtly transformed. People opened up more, as though my lack of interruption signaled a genuine invitation to go deeper. It's remarkable how many confessions, insights, and unpolished truths spill out when someone feels they're being heard without a clock ticking over their head. But here's the thing. This newfound attentiveness also exposed some relationships I'd been overvaluing. When the pace slowed, I noticed who thrived in that quiet and who squirmed. Some friends grew richer in depth, while others, those built mostly on rapid banter or mutual distraction, started to feel thin. It wasn't about judging anyone's worth, just acknowledging that not all connections are meant to survive a shift in rhythm. The same way certain songs only work at a fast tempo, some relationships need constant noise to stay alive. Without it, they fade. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the last sliver of sun slip behind the rooftops, I thought about how my days used to feel crammed, swollen with words and movement. Now, there was air between things, breathing room, and that space didn't feel empty, it felt earned. That's when my grandmother's voice drifted back to me again. She had a way of planting sentences in my head that didn't bloom until years later. Time speaks louder than words, she'd once said, stirring soup at the stove. I'd nodded politely back then, too busy checking my phone to ask what she meant. Now, I think I understand. The way you choose to spend your hours says more about your values than anything you could say out loud. So I made another quiet rule for myself. If I was with someone, I'd be with them. No half-checking my phone. No mental multitasking. And if I couldn't give that kind of attention, I'd rather not meet at all. It sounds small, but it's a form of respect, both for them and for me. My time was no longer an endlessly divisible resource, and my words didn't need to be either. And slowly, in the quiet and the careful conversations, I realized something else. It wasn't just that I was unavailable to others, I was finally available to myself. There's a peculiar kind of clarity that comes when you stop living on constant reply mode. At first, it feels like you're simply rejecting distractions. But before long, you start noticing patterns, not just in the world, but in yourself. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling beside me, I caught myself remembering an odd little fact. The brain is a prediction machine. It doesn't just respond to the present moment, it's constantly anticipating the next one. That's why habits feel like gravity. We repeat what we expect to happen. My old habit had been to respond to everything instantly because that's what I'd trained myself and others to expect. It was in breaking that pattern that I began to see how much of my identity had been built around being the reliable one. Not reliable in the sense of keeping my word or doing quality work, those are good things, but reliable in a way that meant I was always reachable, always ready, always on standby. An old proverb floated into my mind. One my grandfather used to mutter when he saw me racing about, "A candle that burns at both ends is soon nothing but smoke." I'd nodded at the time, thinking it was just another quaint saying from someone who still read newspapers and print. Now, it hit differently. I had been burning at both ends and wondering why the room was filling with haze. The academic in me, yes, I do have one. Couldn't help recalling something I'd once read about role engulfment. It's when a single role, like being a caretaker or a helper, becomes so dominant in your identity that it crowds out everything else. In my case, I wasn't just someone who could help. I was someone who thought I had to help, at all costs. Then came a turning point. My phone rang one Thursday afternoon, an unknown number. The old me would have answered without thinking, prepared to deal with whatever problem or request was on the other end. This time, I let it ring out. The world didn't end. No one sent a search party. Whoever it was didn't even leave a voicemail. A quirky fact came to mind that made me chuckle. The very first voicemail system, invented in the 1970s, was marketed as a revolutionary way to avoid unwanted calls. Somewhere along the way, that flipped into voicemail being yet another obligation to check. Progress, I suppose. As the weeks rolled by, I found that my refusal to be permanently available acted like a sieve, filtering out the noise. Some people adjusted immediately, learning to reach me when it mattered. Others drifted away, perhaps finding someone else to fill the always there role. At first, I worried about those losses. Now, I saw them for what they were, natural pruning. One of the most surprising benefits was how it deepened my relationship with time itself. I started noticing how I felt during different parts of the day. Morning me was sharp and curious. Afternoon me was slower, better suited to quiet tasks. Evening me had a reflective streak. Before, all these selves had been mashed together under the same blur of busy. Now, I could meet each one on its own terms. One evening, walking home under a sky just beginning to bruise with twilight, I remembered my grandmother's kitchen clock. It ticked so loudly you could hear it from the next room. But somehow it was comforting. You could track your whole day by it, when the bread came out of the oven, when the tea was poured, when the neighbors would drop by. In her house, time wasn't something to race against, it was something to walk alongside. And perhaps that's the point. By stepping back from constant availability, I wasn't just saying no to others, I was saying yes to the rhythm of my own days. And that rhythm was teaching me more about who I was than any phone call or ping ever could. There's an almost cinematic quality to the moment you realize you no longer need to respond right away. The world feels a little wider, the air a little cleaner, as if someone has turned down the background static that you didn't even realize was there. It hit me one afternoon while I was standing in the queue at a tiny bakery, the kind with steamed up windows and the faint scent of cinnamon in the air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A reflex twitched in me, muscle memory built from years of living on alert, but I didn't reach for it. Instead, I looked up. The person in front of me was pointing out a tray of pastries to the baker, smiling with the kind of easy joy you can't fake. I caught myself smiling too, and in that moment, I realized I had reclaimed something I hadn't even known I'd lost, the right to be where I was. Old age wisdom floated into my head like the smell of fresh bread. If you're always somewhere else, you're nowhere. My grandfather used to say it when I was younger, usually when I was fiddling with something during family meals. Back then, it sounded cryptic. Now, it felt like the truest thing in the world. That small act, ignoring a notification in favor of the present moment, might sound trivial, but it's quietly radical. It reminded me of an academic debate I once read about continuous partial attention versus mindfulness. The former is what most of us do all day, skimming across the surface of many things at once without diving into any of them. The latter is choosing to notice one thing fully, even if it's just the way the light falls across a table. A quirky fact I stumbled upon recently popped into my head. The average human attention span is now reportedly shorter than that of a goldfish. A goldfish, 8 seconds. If you believe the more dramatic headlines, whether or not that's entirely accurate is debatable. But the point stands, attention has become a scarce currency, and we're spending it like there's no tomorrow. When I started treating my attention as something valuable, something I could invest rather than scatter, my days began to feel different. I lingered longer in moments that used to pass me by. I noticed the sound of rain on the roof, the weight of a book in my hands, the way my coffee tasted sweeter when I wasn't gulping it down between emails. And here's where the shift got interesting. People began to notice. It wasn't that I was suddenly more interesting or magnetic. It was that when I was with someone, I was fully there. I'd look them in the eye, listen without planning my reply, and respond in ways that showed I'd actually heard them. You'd be amazed at how rare that is. One evening, over dinner with a friend, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You've changed. You're calmer." I laughed, partly because it felt true, and partly because I realized she meant it as both a compliment and a curiosity. Calmer wasn't something I'd set out to become. It had arrived quietly, like a cat that shows up at your back door and decides to stay. The more I slowed down, the more I saw how speed had been shaping my choices. Quick responses led to quick commitments, which led to quick exhaustion. When I removed the pressure to be instant, I also removed the tendency to say yes without thinking. Now, I could let things settle, see if they still felt right a day later. Often, they didn't, and that saved me more time and energy than I can measure. Walking home from that dinner, I passed a busker playing an old guitar. His tempo was slow, almost deliberate, as though each chord deserved its own breath. People hurried past, but I stopped. Not because the music was flawless, it wasn't, but because he was there. Fully and unapologetically, I dropped a coin in his case, not out of pity, but in gratitude for the reminder. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is nothing at all, just stand still, listen, and let the world come to you. There's a strange alchemy that happens when you stop rushing to fill every silence. At first, the gaps feel awkward, as though you've forgotten your lines in some ongoing play. But slowly, the silence stops being an empty space to fix and starts being a kind of room, a place where thought can stretch out without bumping into anything. One morning, I found myself on the balcony just after sunrise. The city was still half asleep. You could hear the faint hum of traffic starting up. The odd bird making a bold early appearance. I just stood there, coffee in hand, doing nothing. And in that nothing, an idea that had been hovering at the edge of my mind for weeks suddenly landed. It wasn't profound in the world-changing sense, but it was exactly the solution I'd been looking for to a problem at work. It struck me then, stillness isn't a lack of productivity, it's often the birthplace of it. There's an old age saying I once dismissed as sentimental fluff. The quieter you become, the more you can hear. I used to think it was about listening to others. But lately, I've realized it's just as much about listening to yourself. We spend so much of life drowning in input, messages, news, other people's opinions, that our own thoughts barely get a whisper in. An academic term floated into my mind. Cognitive load? It's the idea that our working memory has a limited capacity, and when it's full, our ability to process new information or solve problems drops sharply. I'd been overfilling mine for years, mistaking constant engagement for sharpness. In truth, I was like a computer with too many tabs open, sluggish, overheating, prone to sudden crashes. Here's a quirky fact I read in a random bookshop find. Albert Einstein famously took long, slow walks when he was stuck on a problem. He called them thought experiments in motion, though I suspect they were just a clever excuse to escape interruptions. Apparently, the theory of relativity didn't arrive in a flurry of all-nighters. It showed up while he was meandering along, hands in his pockets. I decided to try my own version of that. No podcasts, no calls, just a 20-minute walk after lunch. At first, it felt almost itchy, as though my brain was craving some background noise. But then I noticed little things. The particular way one tree's branches curved over the pavement. The fact that the corner shop had repainted its sign. The faint whiff of laundry powder from a window above. These weren't life-altering observations, but they tethered me to the moment in a way nothing else had. It was during one of these walks that I ran into an old acquaintance. We stood chatting for a few minutes, and she said something I didn't expect. "You seem lighter." Not physically, though I had been moving more, but in spirit. It made me realize that stillness doesn't just change how you feel inside, it alters how you carry yourself, and people notice. That evening, I resisted the urge to check my phone before bed. Instead, I sat on the sofa, lights low, and let the day replay itself in my mind. Not as a to-do list, but as a film I'd just watched, scenes, textures, moments that might otherwise blur into oblivion. It felt oddly luxurious, like owning a treasure that no one else could take. And maybe that's the gift silence offers, a kind of personal archive, a place to store the small, golden details that get trampled in the rush. When you slow down enough to notice them, you realize they're the real markers of a life well lived, not the big announcements or flashy milestones, but the quiet in between where you can finally hear yourself think. It's funny how letting go of urgency eventually teaches you to let go of people, too, not out of spite, but out of a strange, peaceful clarity. There was a time when I would have clung to certain connections simply because they'd been in my life for years, even if they'd quietly become one-sided or draining. It's like keeping clothes you don't wear anymore because you once loved them. They just hang there, taking up space, gathering dust, making you feel guilty every time you see them. The shift happened gradually. I started noticing how I felt after spending time with certain people. Some left me energized, inspired, and grounded. Others left me tense, questioning myself, or quietly exhausted. Old age wisdom says, you can't pour from an empty cup. But I think it's more that you shouldn't let someone keep punching a hole in the bottom while you're busy filling it. One afternoon, I sat in a cafe, waiting for a friend who was running late, again. As I sipped my tea, I realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, the constant rescheduling, the distracted glances at their phone, The way our conversations seemed to orbit entirely around their life. If this was a friendship, it was one where I was more an audience than an equal. An academic phrase I'd once stumbled across came to mind: social exchange theory. It's the idea that relationships are essentially transactions of value, emotional, practical, or otherwise. Of course, it's not as cold as it sounds. It's just that when the exchange becomes chronically imbalanced, something has to give. And here's a quirky fact: lobsters, when they outgrow their shells, have to leave them behind entirely. During that in between stage, they're soft, vulnerable, and at risk, but it's the only way they can keep growing. People aren't much different. Sometimes you have to step out of the container you've been in, even if it leaves you feeling exposed for a while. So I made a quiet decision. I would stop chasing. If someone valued my time and presence, they'd make space for it. And if they didn't, I would no longer bend myself into knots trying to hold on. This wasn't about making some grand declaration or staging dramatic goodbyes. It was more like changing the locks on a door that had been swinging open for too long. The results were subtle but profound. I stopped over-explaining why I couldn't make certain plans. I stopped filling silences with nervous chatter. I even stopped replying to messages at lightning speed, just to prove I was there. Funny thing, people adjusted. Those who wanted to stay found a way to meet me in the middle. Those who didn't, well, they just drifted. At first, it felt a little cold, but it wasn't. It was warm in a different way, the kind of warmth you get from sitting in a room where everything belongs and nothing is there out of obligation. One evening, I was sitting at my kitchen table, the soft hum of the fridge in the background, when I realized I felt light. Not in the sense of having no problems, but in the sense of carrying only what was mine to carry. It was the same feeling I got from clearing out a cluttered drawer, space where there hadn't been any. Breathing room I hadn't noticed I needed. And that's the thing no one tells you. Letting go doesn't leave you empty. It just leaves you ready for what fits now. It's remarkable how, once you've cleared space, mentally, emotionally, even physically, new things start finding their way in. Almost like they'd been waiting just beyond the door the whole time. At first, it's tempting to rush to fill that space, to replace the familiar chaos with something equally noisy. But if you hold your nerve, if you let the emptiness breathe for a bit, you start to notice opportunities that feel more aligned, more deliberate. One weekend, with no particular plans, I wandered into a small secondhand bookshop tucked away on a side street I'd passed 100 times, but never explored. Inside, the air was thick with that dusty paper scent that feels like it's been waiting centuries to greet you. I pulled a random book off the shelf, its cover faded, title embossed in gold, and opened it to find a handwritten note on the first page. It was dated 1973 and simply read, "For when you forget you're more than what the world expects." I don't believe in signs in the mystical sense, but sometimes life hands you moments too perfectly timed to ignore. There's an old saying my grandmother used to repeat: "What's meant for you won't pass you by." I used to roll my eyes at it. How could that possibly be true? Surely you had to fight for everything worth having. But in the quiet, I've begun to suspect there's a kind of truth there. Not in the sense of fate handing you exactly what you want, but in the sense that when you stop filling your hands with what doesn't serve you, they're suddenly free to receive something better. Psychologists might call it attentional bias, the tendency to notice more of what you're open to seeing. When I was buried under constant noise, I didn't notice half the opportunities around me because my attention was maxed out. Clear the clutter, and it's as if the background shifts into sharper focus. Here's a quirky fact I learned recently. In Japan, there's a concept called mei, which refers to the empty space between things. It's not seen as wasted or lacking, but as an essential element that gives everything else its shape. A pause in music, the space between brushstrokes in calligraphy, even the gaps in conversation, they all exist to make what surrounds them more meaningful. I think life works the same way. With that in mind, I started saying yes more selectively. I joined a small community pottery class, not because I had some deep yearning to work with clay, but because I'd always liked the idea of making something with my hands. The first session was mostly us laughing at our wobbly creations, and the instructor telling us that perfection was boring anyway. It was oddly liberating. A week later, a neighbor I'd only ever waved to in passing stopped me in the lobby to ask if I'd like to help out at the local garden project. Before, I'd probably have mumbled something about being busy. Instead, I said yes. Now, every Saturday morning, I find myself among rows of vegetables and herbs, hands in the soil, swapping stories with people I might never have met otherwise. And here's the unexpected part. These small, almost accidental decisions have started weaving together into something that feels like a life I actually chose, rather than one I simply ended up with. I think the academic expression for this might be self-directed growth. But for me, it just feels like being awake. The spaces I once tried to fill with noise now hold things I value. And the best part, I didn't have to force any of it. It's strange how, once you begin living with more intention, you start noticing patterns you were blind to before. Habits, dynamics, even self-sabotaging little loops you've been walking in for years. They don't announce themselves with flashing lights. They're more like faint footprints in the sand that only become visible when the tide goes out. One evening, while washing dishes, I caught myself rehearsing a conversation I'd never have. You know the kind, imaginary debates with people who annoyed you, except you win every single point with flawless movie script precision. It was mildly amusing at first, but then I thought, why am I even giving mental airtime to someone who isn't here and might not even be thinking about me? The realization hit hard. A lot of my energy still leaked into places that didn't matter. Old age wisdom says, where your attention goes, your energy flows. I used to think that was just another poetic throwaway line, but in this moment, I saw how literal it was. By replaying certain grievances or chasing certain validations in my head, I was basically watering weeds and wondering why the garden felt overgrown. So, I started conducting what I jokingly called micro audits of my thoughts, not in a harsh, self-critical way, but in a curious, almost scientific one. If I caught myself mentally spiraling, I'd pause and ask, is this thought helping me or just keeping me entertained in the worst possible way? 9 times out of 10. It was the latter, a quirky fact I came across in a documentary about the brain. Apparently, your mind can't tell the difference between vividly imagining something and actually experiencing it. The same neural pathways light up either way. That means that by replaying old arguments or failures, I was basically re-traumatizing myself on loop, like hitting repeat on a bad song out of habit. It made me think about a term I once read in a psychology paper, cognitive load theory. It suggests that our working memory has a limited capacity, and when it's cluttered with irrelevant information, our ability to learn and make decisions suffers, which, translated into real life, basically means if you keep carrying junk in your mental backpack, you've got no room for the good stuff. So, I began experimenting with small mental boundaries. I wouldn't scroll social media first thing in the morning anymore, not because it's evil, but because it let too many other people's lives take up prime real estate in my head before my own day even started. I also stopped engaging in conversations that were clearly designed to provoke. I'm not saying I've ascended into saint-like serenity, but I've learned to spot the bait before I bite. One morning, walking to the garden project, I realized how much lighter my mind felt. There was space between thoughts, like fresh air moving through an open window. It wasn't that my life was suddenly free of challenges, but the challenges I did have finally felt like mine to solve, not imported drama from somewhere else. And in that space, I noticed something else. More often than not, the things that used to trigger me now just passed through, like clouds that no longer threatened rain. That's when I understood that peace isn't found by controlling everything around you, it's by controlling what you let inside. There's a quiet sort of power in becoming the person who doesn't react the way people expect. It's not about being cold or detached, far from it, but about holding your ground without letting someone else's storm decide your weather. I didn't realize how much I'd been living in reaction mode until I stopped. One rainy Tuesday, I was in a cafe, notebook open, nursing the kind of tea that comes in a pot and feels like an invitation to linger. 2 tables over, a couple were arguing, not in loud, dramatic bursts, but in that clipped, icy tone that cuts sharper than shouting. I caught myself starting to eavesdrop, which I'll admit is one of my favorite bad habits, and then just didn't. I let my attention drift back to my notes. It felt oddly rebellious, like refusing to feed a fire that wasn't mine to tend. My grandfather used to say, "Not every ball that's thrown at you needs to be caught." I laughed at it as a child, imagining him ducking tennis balls or cricket catches, but now, it's a philosophy I keep close. When you refuse to catch every emotional projectile someone hurls your way, you protect your energy for the things that actually matter. There's also something quietly magnetic about people who aren't easily swayed. I've noticed that when you no longer respond predictably, whether that's by snapping back, apologizing unnecessarily, or scrambling to fix what isn't yours to fix, others begin to approach you differently. Some even stop testing your boundaries entirely because there's no reward in it anymore. Here's a quirky fact I stumbled upon while reading about behavioral psychology. In experiments with pigeons, researchers found that inconsistent reinforcement, giving a reward sometimes, but not always, made the pigeons peck the button even more obsessively than when they were rewarded every time. Humans aren't so different. If you sometimes give in to guilt or manipulation, it teaches others to keep pressing that button. Stop reinforcing it, and eventually, the behavior fades. Of course, holding your ground isn't always comfortable. There were moments where silence felt heavy, like it needed to be filled, or where walking away made me wonder if I was being too proud. But over time, I learned the difference between pride and self-respect. Pride is brittle. It needs constant defending. Self-respect is steady. It doesn't need to shout. Academically, I suppose this could be tied to locus of control, the extent to which we believe we have power over our own lives. When you operate from an internal locus, you stop blaming circumstances for everything, but you also stop letting circumstances dictate who you are in the moment. And the more I practiced it, the more freeing it became. Conversations that used to drain me no longer had the same pull. Triggers that once sent me spiraling became minor ripples on a much calmer surface. It's not that I'd become unfeeling. If anything, I felt more deeply, but in ways I actually chose. The real magic, life started to feel less like a constant reaction to what was happening, and more like something I was actively shaping, and that shift changed everything. When I think about the idea of becoming the standard, it's not about arrogance or putting myself on some untouchable pedestal. It's about quietly embodying a way of living that others instinctively measure themselves against. I didn't set out to do this. In fact, if you told me years ago that people would one day look at my life and think I should raise my own bar, I would have laughed and pointed at the mess I was then wading through. It began subtly. The more I lived according to my own values instead of molding myself to fit someone else's expectations, the more I noticed people treating me differently. At first, it was small things. Friends would ask for my opinion before making decisions. Colleagues would consult me on situations that had nothing to do with my role. Strangers would take note of how I spoke or carried myself. I didn't feel more important, but I felt anchored. Old age wisdom says, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. That was me. For far too long, agreeable to a fault, bending under the weight of every request, desperate to keep the peace, even if it meant sacrificing my own. Now, my decisions come from a place of quiet clarity. And interestingly, people notice when you're not desperate to be liked. It often makes them respect you more. One quirky fact I read recently: in group dynamics, the person who speaks last is often perceived as the most authoritative, even if they don't say much. It's not just the content of the words, it's the energy of self-assurance. I started experimenting with this not as some manipulative trick, but as a practice in patience. I found that listening fully before speaking meant my words landed with more weight. Academically, I think this edges into the realm of social proof, a term used in behavioral science to describe how people tend to follow the lead of those they perceive as confident or successful. I wasn't consciously trying to become a blueprint for anyone, but the more I lived in alignment with my own values, the more I realized my example could be either a silent permission slip or a quiet challenge for others to rise. This shift didn't mean everyone loved me for it. In fact, some people resented it. Not everyone is comfortable with you changing, especially if it forces them to examine their own choices. Some drifted away, but I didn't chase. I understood now that I was no longer playing to keep everyone on side. One evening, a friend I hadn't seen in years messaged me out of the blue. I don't know what you've done with your life lately, but you seem solid, different, in a good way. I smiled, because she just described exactly how I felt: solid, not unshakable, not invincible, just deeply rooted in who I was. And that's the thing about becoming the standard. You're not trying to be above anyone. You're simply unwilling to live beneath your own expectations ever again. Living unapologetically rare didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, sometimes painful pruning of the parts of me that existed only to please, impress, or be chosen. The rare part isn't about thinking you're better than others. It's about being so anchored in your own truth that you stop offering discounts on your worth just to fit into someone else's budget. I remember sitting alone in a park one crisp autumn afternoon, the air sharp enough to sting my lungs, watching leaves loosen from their branches and float to the ground. That's what it felt like, letting go of the people and habits that couldn't survive the season I was in. There was grief in it, yes, but also a strange calm. I no longer felt the urgency to explain myself, to justify why certain people no longer had a seat at my table. There's an old saying my grandmother loved: a pearl doesn't apologize for being rare. It's not its fault the world is full of pebbles. For years, I rolled my eyes at that kind of thing, thinking it was just romantic fluff. Now I understand. It's about knowing your nature and not trying to sand it down so others feel more comfortable holding you. Here's a quirky fact that struck me the other day. Saffron, the most expensive spice in the world, comes from hand-picking tiny threads from a particular type of crocus. It's rare because it requires patience, precision, and an unwillingness to rush the process. That's how I've started to see my life. Worthwhile things often take more time, more intention, and fewer hands in the mix. Academically, you could argue this touches on scarcity value, the principle that rarity increases perceived worth. But here's the nuance. The goal isn't to be scarce to manipulate others into wanting you. It's to live in a way that is naturally uncommon because you refuse to dilute yourself. Living unapologetically rare means you no longer need the noise of constant validation to feel secure. You can be alone without feeling lonely. You can walk away without feeling diminished. You can choose stillness over chaos, depth over attention, quality over quantity, and in that choice, you stop waiting for someone else to recognize your value because you've already recognized it yourself. That is where the real freedom begins. The journey here was not marked by grand, dramatic gestures, but by quiet, deliberate shifts, moments of choosing not to react, of valuing my time, of walking away without fanfare. I learned that worth is not something to be chased in the eyes of others, but something to be lived from within. Each boundary drawn, each pause before speaking, each decision to stay or leave became part of a larger truth. I am allowed to live in a way that feels good to me, even if it doesn't please everyone else. I began as someone desperate to be understood, to be chosen, to be loved in the exact way I had imagined. What I found instead was that love, whether from others or for myself, cannot thrive where self-abandonment lives. And so, I let go. I let go of the endless explanations, of the subtle bargains that traded pieces of me for moments of approval, of the old reflex to prove my worth. Now, I move through the world quietly certain of who I am. I know not everyone will see it, and that is fine. The ones who do are the ones who are meant to, and as the noise fades, what remains is a steady, unshaken presence, a life lived unapologetically rare.